With Season 11 now well underway, it's safe to say that the overhaul of the item system in League of Legends has completely altered the game as we know it for better or worse. But before those fundamental systems were reworked, there was a rich history with items dating all the way back since the start of the game. In the Forgotten Runes video, I mentioned later on I would be releasing a similar video discussing forgotten items. By the way, thank you all so much for the wonderful reception I got on that video. I was completely blown away at how many views it got, considering it's not a why no one plays, so I just want to say I appreciate that. Today though, we'll be talking about forgotten items in the game, more specifically the items before Season 11. It's been only about 6 months since the rework, so there's not enough empirical data to make any judgments or substantiated analysis on mythics and whatnot quite yet. Over the past decade, items have been created, reworked, and in cases removed from the game. The reasons for why those changes or removals took place were determined by a number of reasons, such as does the versatility and generalistic benefit of the item monopolize the builds on a large majority of champions? Is the item so ridiculously unfair that it causes more frustration for the opponents dealing with that item than it does satisfaction for the player purchasing the item? Or does the item feel too underwhelming or impractical to be worth not only the gold required to buy it, but the precious item slot it occupies? Those are some of many examples for why items are removed or reworked from the game. If you want a more in-depth primer on removed items, I made a more detailed video a while back should you be interested. Also, this video will repeat a few points from that one. To many of us, when we think of popular items, the first ones to come to mind are Black Cleaver, Luden's Echo, Infinity Edge, Sunfire Cape, and such. Naturally so. Black Cleaver was widely sought after by bruisers and fighters due to providing health, damage, cooldown reduction, movement speed, and the passive armor shred, which basically amounted to flat armor penetration that scaled over time. It worked well on pretty much any melee physical damage dealer that did not rely on auto attacks to deal the bulk of their damage. Luden's Echo was the AP version of that. It gave ability power, a huge supply of mana, and cooldown reduction, along with a passive that gave you extra burst damage every so often with an ability. It was able to take care of the two things mages struggle with the most right away, mana and cooldowns. In some cases you would see Hex-type GLP or Rod of Ages purchased instead, depending on whether or not you wanted more durability, area control, or damage. But you really could not go wrong with damage. Sunfire Cape had the same principle as the former two. It gave tanks exactly the stats they needed, health and armor, but it also gave consistent damage that they could use in a fight because they would be on targets for a long time. These were usually the first purchase on a lot of champions for their combination of stats, prices, and effects. Conversely, there were some items who some players probably never even knew existed even if they've been playing for a long time. There was one in particular though that was legendary for being very well known in the game, but basically anyone who wasn't Trick 2G never purchased the item, and that's Ohmwrecker. Quite an interesting specimen of an item. In terms of stats, it was not too far off from a standard tank item. 300 health, 50 armor, and 10% cooldown reduction, and some HP regen. Not too bad just by looking at that. It came with a passive and active too. Point Runner carried over from Raptor Cloak, which gave you bonus movement speed near structures, and honestly it helped a lot for getting to lane if you bought it early. The active effect was definitely unique to say the least. Ohmwrecker was able to disarm towers for a few seconds, effectively allowing you to tower dive more easily since you no longer had to worry about towers for 3 seconds, which was usually enough time to dispatch someone. Given the importance of acquiring an early game advantage, Ohmwrecker would appear to be a pretty viable item, since every 2 minutes if you were playing an early game bully like Darius, Pantheon, Renekton, Draven, or Jace to name a few, this would all but seal any hopes your opponent had of hunkering down and farming under tower, because there was no tower to hide behind. This would have been an amazing item to pick up for a lot of champions looking to snowball quickly, since towers were the only thing that prevented people from closing games out very fast. But there were two things in particular that sort of ruined that dream. The first being its stats. Ohmwrecker is classified as a tank item, but tanks aren't exactly good at tower diving on account of their low damage output. And even if you were playing a super beefy Vanguard like Malphite or Ornn who could get chonky rather early, towers still do a massive amount of damage early on due to being equipped with 30% armor penetration. The only way tanks could achieve a successful dive is if the enemy laner was injured enough to be bursted in a single rotation of abilities, in which case you likely could have achieved the same level of success purchasing a Sunfire Cape, which actually gives you damage to work with. Of course, it wouldn't be wise to buy this on a fighter or a bruiser because they need attack damage. They need Black Cleaver, Blade of the Ruined King, Triforce, things like that. The second problem was that Ohmwrecker suffered from sort of a timing issue. See, the benefit of going Luden's, Black Cleaver, Triforce, Infinity Edge and such was that they gave immediate combat stats, and since your first purchase is always your most important, You wanted to pick up whatever gave you the most combat pressure to get ready to clap some cheeks in the mid-game. Ohmwrecker had some decent base stats but provided no combat effects. If we compare this to Spirit Visage and Sunfire Cape, usually the go-to first items for a tank, the former gave you way better base stats and bonus healing, which was always nice, and the latter gave you a magic damage aura which did even more with hard crowd control. By purchasing Ohmwrecker, you placed yourself in a combat disadvantage. Most of the time, utility or defensive items like Zhonya's, Banshees, and Death's Stance would be your third item at the earliest. However, by then you're well into the mid-game where chances are most fights you enter will be 2v2s, 3v3s, or full-on teamfights. Also by then, tower dives will become much easier to pull off since even squishy champions can tank 2 or 3 more shots at level 13 plus compared to level 6 just by virtue of their higher base armor and health. And of course, tanks will be way beefier now, which means they can probably face tank 20 tower shots before actually going down. In other words, what made Ohmwrecker such an unfavorable item was because the active effect was specifically geared towards the early game, but you couldn't afford to get it early on since it had subpar gold efficiency and combat stats. But when you got to a point where you could get it, you no longer needed to since towers aren't that scary anymore. The next item I wanted to talk about is Sanguine Blade. I remember at the start of Preseason 10 when this first was announced, people were furious. 3000 gold, 50 AD, 15% lifesteal, 10 lethality, and if you were either alone or near an isolated champion, you would receive another 8 lethality and 40 to 100% bonus attack speed. The sheer amount of stats this item gave you made you essentially impossible to 1v1 unless you yourself also had one. In a way, Sanguine Blade shared an identical condition with Spear of Shojin. Spear of Shojin was notorious for having one of the best single item power spikes in the game, probably second only to Deathfire Grasp. In an average game, having the gestalt of multiple item components would grant you a noteworthy benefit over an enemy who just had the sum of its individual parts. For example, before its rework, Black Cleaver required Phage, Kindle Gem, and 950 gold. Even if you and your lane opponent had the same amount of gold, if they had a Phage, Kindle Gem, and let's say a pickaxe, but you had Black Cleaver, you were stronger than them, though not by too much. They could still outplay you even though you have a completed item and they don't. But Shojin produced a power spike so immense that most of the time it would give you more power in a head-on fight than someone with 2 items. Top lane was basically decided on whoever was able to purchase Shojin first, because you literally insta-lost against Renekton, Jax, Riven, and such. It was a pretty fun time. Anyway, we all know what happened to that item, so what's the deal with Sanguine Blade? Right after it was reintroduced to the game, Riot realized just how overloaded the stats on the item were and hotfixed it to curb the attack speed. Usually people purchased their first item by level 8 or 9, which meant Sanguine Blade gave you at least 65% attack speed, 50 AD, 15% lifesteal, and 18 lethality if you were alone, such as in top lane. If memory serves, its gold efficiency was something like 140% at max level, which meant you were getting so much value out of one item. But after the nerfs, the item went from a must-have first purchase to pretty much non-existent, where it stayed irrelevant since then. So how come an item that when first announced everyone thought would completely break the game, apparently be less of an appealing purchase than items like Blade of the Ruined King or Youmuu's Ghostblade, which were similar first purchases? Just like Ohmwrecker, there are 2 problems to this item. The first is that its passive attack speed and lethality boost only worked when you were alone or against one champion, and in the mid to late game, most fights are either 2v2s, 3v3s, or 5v5s, meaning you'd only be able to maintain 100% uptime if you were split pushing. That used to be a viable win condition way back in the day, but nowadays it's harder to pull off due to the inflated necessity of securing objectives like Baron and Elder Dragon. Also, with higher overall mobility in the game, you have much less time to shove a lane before the enemy team rotates to stop you. So for the most part, players have just defaulted to winning games by acing the enemy team and then running it down with Baron buff or something. The second problem, Sanguine Blade provides absolutely nothing but stats, while other items brought unique effects to the table. As I mentioned when talking about Black Cleaver, the value of a completed item stems mostly from its unique passive or active, which usually overpowers raw numbers. Sanguine Blade's issue is that even though it packs so much gold efficiency, it didn't have anything that supplemented a champion. Those that would have benefited from its purchase, such as skirmishers and assassins, would probably have gotten the same benefit, if not more, from Blade of the Ruined King, which also gives lifesteal, attack damage, and attack speed, albeit less of each and no lethality, but it gave percent current health damage and an active that stole movement speed, neither of which were conditional. Sure, Borg was more expensive, but it was way more consistent, and the percent health damage ensured your attacks will scale well into the late game as champions get more health. This was one of the main things Riot aimed to rework during the items overhaul in Season 11. They wanted every item to serve both a unique and practical purpose. That was the point of Mythics. Eclipse was for quick trades, Gore Drinker was for teamfight sustain, Immortal Shield Bow was for burst protection, Prowler's Claw was for gap closing, Kraken Slayer was for countering tanks, etc. Surprisingly, Sanguine Blade was one of the items to survive the transition. Now, I know what you're thinking, there are tons of items that provide nothing but stats, yet are still way more popular. That is true, we have items like Rabadon's Death Cap, which is literally only an AP battery, but remember the first problem, Sanguine's conditionality, and how it's only useful in a specific circumstance, whereas Death Cap is always active. There were a few other items in the game that were relegated to obscurity for having similar problems as the first two I talked about. Adaptive Helm was just a far less versatile version of Spirit Visage because it was only useful against repetitive magic damage like Brand, Teemo, Syndra, Katarina, Rumble, things like that, and it also didn't work against physical damage or auto attacks. But Spirit Visage was just as good against those champions anyway since there's so much healing and regeneration in the game in the past couple seasons. Not to mention, it gave less health than Visage and had a much worse build path. Abyssal Mask was also a dead item on pretty much anyone besides Ornn. It gave pitifully awful base stats and the bonus damage passive made no sense because the only champions that could reliably proc it will be tanks, but tanks aren't built to do damage. Now, I understand it's damage from any source, meaning you can get a 5-man Malphite ultimate and now the entire enemy team takes 10% more damage, but if you landed a 5-man Malphite ult, you don't need 10% more damage because chances are your team will have destroyed them already. This was another item that carried over into Season 11 despite very rarely being purchased. But now, there's Force of Nature, which is almost infinitely better. For 200 more gold, you get 5% movement speed and in combat another 40 move speed and 20 magic resist. Zephyr was actually an item that I really miss because it was a perfect swap out for champions that brought either Berserker's Greaves or Merc Treads and wanted a 6 damaging item without compromising on mobility and either attack speed or tenacity. It gave 25 AD, 10% cooldown reduction, 50% attack speed, and 10% move speed. The 10% bonus move speed usually amounted to about 35 to 40, so you took about a 10 to 15 MS cut, but you were still fast enough to rotate with your team, dodge skill shots and stuff. The 50% attack speed was a direct upgrade to the 35 from Zerx, and then you got more damage, 10% more cooldown reduction if you still needed it, and the same tenacity bonus from Merc Treads. That being said, that's all it was good for. It was a terrible item to buy first, second, third, fourth, or even fifth, and there aren't that many games that go to full build anyway, much less so now. These items were never purchased for the same reason no one took Omnistone. There were very specific circumstances for them to be good, but it's safer to choose something that consistently works all the time than something that's inconsistent even if it may work better in those cases. A ton of items have come and gone throughout League's enduring lifespan, and we have yet to find out if there's going to be more of them in the future, since based on how things are going right now, new items are pretty good. Aside from maybe Sanguine and Abyssal, every item has been purchased quite frequently across a good number of games, and now we have a new split push counter item coming out for tanks, which should be pretty interesting. So let me know what your thoughts are on forgotten items. Are there any you wish to see come back? I, for one, aside from Zephyr, want Brutalizer back in the game. That item was so good for so many top laners back in the day. And while we're at it, what do you think could be done to items like Abyssal and Sanguine Blade to make them more appealing to buy? You know, aside from giving them more stats because that would be way too easy. If you enjoyed this video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Also check out the description down below for links to my Discord and social media, as well as a playlist containing all my discussion videos if you'd like to watch more. But that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.